Well, welcome, Tonia.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So, if anyone checks out your profile on LinkedIn, and I know this because I did,
Because you did.
they'll see that your experience runs the gamut from working as a grant consultant, working for a grant maker, and serving in a variety of capacities for nonprofits and other organizations as well. We always love to hear our guests' origin story. So, how did you even get into the grant world to begin with?
I think
By
you,
accident.
Were you weren't born knowing one day I'm going to be an
No.
expert on federal
No.
Mom, when I grow up. No. Okay.
The funny thing is, my degree is actually in political science and peace and conflict studies with a minor in Russian. And my dad used to tease me that I would never be able to do anything with political science.
Yes.
And here I am today talking about appropriations. So,
Which
Dad,
is political.
right?
There's a
My
science
degree was
to
worth
it.
something, Dad.
Yes, absolutely.
Did he want you to be an accountant?
No,
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I think he just knew I was destined for great things, as all parents
Destined
do.
for
Oh,
great.
yeah.
Right. So, I was initially, as I mentioned, my degree is in peace and conflict studies. So I was working for a nonprofit that did community mediation in
Okay.
Michigan.
All right.
Because in Michigan, you do not need to be an attorney in order to be a mediator. So I worked for this nonprofit, which primarily their income was based on contracts through the state for doing community mediations. And I heard about this thing called a grant that we could apply for to get some extra funds.
Shocking.
Yes.
A grant. It's almost like you're here at a GrantSummit. And we're recording live, and so you might hear noise in the background, and that's all okay.
Yes,
part of the
Everybody-
process.
It's all
Yeah.
okay.
So I went to my boss and I said, hey, there's this thing called a grant. Can I apply for it? Because we really wanted to try this pilot program, but we didn't have the funds for
Yeah.
it. And she's like, you want to do something that's not in your job description for free on your own time? Sure, go ahead.
Yes.
So I wrote my first grant, and the first 3 or 4 of them that I did, I had beginner's luck, and I kept getting every single one of them. And they were small, don't get me
Yes.
wrong.
But still,
They're small,
no,
right?
no.
But then I was like, oh, this grant writing thing is easy, right? No
Anybody
problem.
can do it.
And then I got my first couple of rejections. So it was not my primary responsibility or task. And so it was just sort of something that I did on the periphery. So I actually took a departure in my career, and I've done things from special events planning to I was a federal investigator
Oh.
to a costume designer, right? Don't ask.
Please don't judge the Halloween costumes we're going to put on later. Just don't.
So,
Just don't.
I realized about 10 years into sort of my professional career, and as it had waxed and waned in different directions, that I really missed doing the grant writing, and I really missed being an advocate and trying to, promote an organization, a cause, an initiative to get the funding. And I felt that I was good at it. So I applied for a grant writer job. And so I have been a grant writer, I have been a development manager, I was the regional grant manager for the American Red Cross for a number of years. And then, as you mentioned, I eventually started working for a grant maker. I worked for the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne. And that was a great job. It was very different. You're on the other side of things. And in addition to that, I've also done grant reviewing. So I feel like I've had a very interesting kind of, I wasn't sure what I wanted to be when I grew up, but I'm happy that I'm here kind of thing. So now I work for the Grant Plant. It's a national grants consultancy firm.
It's a cute name, sorry.
It is.
Go
It
ahead.
is great, right? It's funny because for many years, I had my own freelance business, which was the Grant Crafter. And
Okay,
so
I
they're the
can see
grant
that.
plants. So yeah,
Costuming, crafting.
right, exactly. You craft a proposal, in my
You do.
opinion.
You do.
So, and I started with the grant plant about 4 years ago. I was initially a resource development officer, which is essentially pre-proposal grant writing. I became a resource development officer 2, then a senior resource development officer, and now I'm in the position of grant compliance manager. So my role has kind of taken me from being on the pre-award proposal side to the post-award grant management side, but I still do a lot of pre-award work just because I miss it, I love it, and I'm like, don't forget me over there. So
Oh,
that's kind of my weird origin story and backstory of what I've done and how I'm here.
No one has a straightforward grant origin
Right.
story, so
Right.
I think one person that we've talked to, or
it was
two,
kind of like they knew.
they
Yeah,
knew,
they
but
knew.
They knew like when they were maybe as an undergrad.
Yeah.
Like they knew, but no one else has been like, when I was 12 years old, I want to be a grant writer. That's not really.
Yeah, I think I've met one person at another conference who said, I went to school saying I want to be a grant manager. They, of course, didn't have a degree in grant, or not grant management, grant writing.
Yeah.
Don't have a degree. There are some certificates and some programs, but not a proper university degree or even a specialty, right? But they knew from the get-go. So I think most people say, yeah, I kind of fell into it on accident.
I think Amanda was voluntold.
Yep.
Yep,
That's how it started.
it's not uncommon either.
So you're here now at the Grant Summit, and I'm going to look down because I don't want to get the title wrong.
Okay,
Federal Appropriations, winning congressional earmarks.
yes.
I know what they are.
Yeah.
I've been around long enough to when they used to be really popular. They went away, they came back.
Uh-huh.
But for people who don't know, can you give us like a thumbnail overview of just defining
Sure.
what appropriations earmarks
Yes.
are now?
Yes. Okay. So I want to give a quick caveat. The word earmarks is kind of a dirty word. You've got to be careful using
That's
it.
why I like to say it.
Yes. Yeah. So there are a
It
couple.
used to be called pork. And
Yes,
that was
that's
really
an
bad.
even that's
a real
even worse.
no-no.
If you slip and say earmarks, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
And I actually debated about whether or not to put that word in the title.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, and this is like sort of part of the history of earmarks and appropriations, there has never been a good word for it until fairly recently of what they are. And so most
Yeah.
people don't understand appropriations,
But they
which
know
is
what
why,
earmark.
which is why I use both words to kind of get that recognition.
Yeah.
But I always give that disclaimer at the
That's
beginning
fair.
of things,
That's
right?
fair.
So I say, be careful using the word earmarks. It's not the end of the world if you use that word. But certainly if you're speaking with one of your Congress people, you're probably going to want to use the terms congressionally directed spending if you're talking to your
Oh,
senator.
that just rolls off the tip of your tongue.
Or because the Senate and the House always have to do it differently. If you're talking to your representative, it is the community projects funding.
Yep.
So it's either the CDS or the CPF. But in the end, most people are just referring to it now as congressionally directed spending, which makes sense. It's essentially discretionary appropriations.
But what, if you said appropriations,
Yeah.
would no matter, I mean, would people get that or
So
no?
this is the political science
She says,
degree in me, right? So an appropriation is basically the authorization of Congress to spend money,
Okay.
right?
Like the appropriations
so,
bills.
Yeah.
for
Right.
each department.
So there
Yeah.
are 12 bills that they have to create independently of each other, and each bill is like different departments. So
Yep.
one is USDA, rural development, FDA, one of them is commerce, science, and
Yep.
justice, right? So they've got these 12 bills or accounts. And then in the end, they create an omnibus. So they package them all together, and then that's what becomes
And then they
our-
fight about it.
And don't agree on it for a long, long time.
For very months, yeah. So it's more appropriate to say discretionary appropriations,
Okay.
but
I mean-
even then, it's not a good term because the bill to Ukraine to send money to them was discretionary appropriations.
Oh.
So it doesn't always conjure the right
Okay.
thing, which is why the terms congressionally directed spending and community projects funding are starting to build up
Right.
some more steam. And these are terms that were only introduced about 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's like the long history of what exactly we're talking about. We're talking about these special projects where you're going to your Congress people to say, hey, we have this thing in the community
Right.
we'd like to do
Right.
for the benefit of the public. We would like some funding to help build either the infrastructure or the program or whatever. And we want you to legislate that Congress will send us money to do this program. So that is what we're talking about when we're talking about appropriations or discretionary appropriations or earmarks, or don't use the words pork barrel spending, right?
Yes.
But that was a pejorative.
I'm a vegetarian. I'm just not going to.
You don't want to,
Yes.
yeah. Well, and that's honestly why they did away with appropriations or earmarks, because it was getting this really nasty negative reputation
yeah.
with things like the bridge to nowhere.
Yep. That's
The big
first one.
dig,
Yep.
right? Where there were these awful.
So we're just going to call it a new name. Nothing to
Yes.
see here.
A little bit. I think
I
they
mean, no, it's-
realized there was not appropriate oversight, and that's where they were going wrong. And I think they realized
Appropriations
that.
were not appropriately overseen.
Yes.
happens.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, you never hear that anywhere else.
I was just digging my heels in it against using another acronym, but I will do my level best, and thank you for explaining it in a
Yes.
way that it's really clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good language. So, well, you kind of mentioned this, so it had been around because I
Yeah.
remember I first started in the grant field in 2001, and I wrote a lot of these back
Yeah.
when it was called earmarks and pork, and then around 2011, I believe, is when
Yes.
they started. And I remember before it officially was stopped, there were a few congressmen that were saying, "I don't care that it exists. I'm not doing
Right.
it." and they were kind of making a stand.
Yeah.
So why is it you think Congress has brought them back? And is that a good thing that they did?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, but I'm going to try to give you both sides.
I like it.
Okay.
Because you're a
Let's hear it.
mediator.
I am a mediator, and I'm a political
No, man,
diplomat.
lay it
yeah.
out. Lay it out.
So, so I am going to talk about Republicans and Democrats,
Yes.
and I'm not going to be picking on either side. But there are
It is
some
what it
facts.
is. Yeah.
There are some facts that we have to talk about.
That's
right?
what we got to work with.
So the Republicans were growing increasingly concerned that there was too much spending for these discretionary appropriations, which at the time that was the term that was used. Okay,
All right.
and there were these bad media stories like the Big Dig and the Bridge to Nowhere, and they said, listen, we're the party of conservative spending. Why are we engaging in this process where we're spending more than what we need to? And on top of that, we're the ones that are promoting that we try to be fiscally responsible and make sure that we're not increasing our debt.
Yeah.
So in 2011, for federal fiscal year 2012, they said the House Republicans got together and they did a self-imposed moratorium on discretionary appropriations, or earmarks as they were called then.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they said, that's it. We will not engage in this process anymore. And although the Senate didn't necessarily say the same thing, which I believe at the time the Senate was controlled by the Democrats, if one half of the legislature is unwilling to play ball, it really kind of stopped it dead in its tracks.
Yeah.
Now, here's the important thing to understand, right?
Lean in.
This is where we get into the gossip, the
good
juicy
stuff.
tea, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So my first appropriation that I ever wrote was, or requested, was in 2010 for federal fiscal year 2011. But I also got one in federal fiscal year 2012. So how's that possible, right? Because they were not officially a thing.
Yeah.
Well, the truth was that there were still all of these projects that were getting, you've heard the term riders,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there were all these riders that were added to bills. So these appropriations were still happening.
I just want to say right quick, it's riders, because I know I say it with my accent.
Not
And
writers.
it sounds like riders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like riders,
No,
like
R-I-D-E-R.
riders of the
Yeah.
storm.
A rider to the bill, yeah.
There you
yes. So, so they were still doing them behind the scenes, and I know this because I worked with a prominent Republican senator at the time to get our appropriation request into the federal fiscal year 2012 bill, right?
Yep.
And if you look at spending, the spending went from something like 3.8 million in 2011, but continued to increase even when accounting for inflation, right? Continued to increase to 4.4 million or 4.2, somewhere right around there in 2019. And I say 2019 because 2020 things got real crazy
Yeah,
with
yeah.
the budget.
Yes, sure,
so,
sure.
but to give you a sense, right?
Yeah.
So the spending was not decreasing, right? And I think at that point, everybody was like, okay. Let's just be real honest here about what has been going on. Not only have we continued to do these discretionary appropriations or earmarks, but we've put them behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And now there has been even less oversight and transparency. And so in 2021, 10 years later, for federal fiscal year 2022, the House Republicans got together and said, okay, we are going to lift this moratorium and we are going to engage in this process, but we're going to do so in an outwardly public and transparent way. And they issued a bunch of rules at that time about how these could be done. So for representatives in that very first year that they came back, each representative, there's 435, right? Each representative could only do 10 requests up to maximum.
Okay.
Now, the last 2 years, they've increased it. It's 15 requests per representative, but they made sure they were going to really, really limit it, okay? So they made sure that they put in rules like the amount of discretionary appropriations cannot exceed 1% of overall spending, because in the 1960s, it was 47%.
Okay, that's a lot.
Okay.
Wow.
That's a
Now,
lot.
by the time we got to 2011, when they got rid of them, they definitely had decreased that substantially. So we have been doing better and better about fewer of these and really sort of cherry picking the right projects.
Yeah.
But there was this massive attempt when they came back in 2022 to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to do it. The GAO is going to audit a sampling of these to make sure that they're being appropriately handled. So I think it was good, right? I believe that it was a good thing that they came back and they did so in a way that there was going to be a lot more transparency. Now, you still have some Republicans that say, I will not participate in it. It's against my moral beliefs and our platform. And so that is another issue that people that might want to pursue appropriations have to contend with. with. If you have a Republican senator and or representatives that are not willing to participate in this, you might not have a lot of options.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true.
Well, that actually kind of goes then into the next question. Is
Okay.
that the first step then? If you are listening and you're like, oh, I want to get some of that.
Yes.
That is not called an appropriation. But is that the first step, is to sort of do the old which way's the wind blowing with their
Yes.
elected officials?
Yeah, you're going to have to find out if your Congress people are willing to participate in the process. Now, the good news for those who want to do this is that more and more Republicans have been coming into the fold and
Yeah.
participating. So when they came back in 2022, I believe that there was about 100, just over 100 representatives of the 435, so about a quarter of them who would not participate. So you had a 25% chance that your representative was not going to participate.
Yeah.
Additionally, there have been 29 senators since 2022 who have said we will not participate. And in 10 states, both senators have refused. So those 10 states, if both of your senators won't play ball, the only one you can go to possibly is your representative, and hope that your representative for your respective district will.
Okay.
Now, there were 3 states in 2022 who got $0 of earmarks because both of their senators and their
They just
representative at large said
Said
no.
no.
Yeah.
That
So that's the first thing you want to do is see, will my senator or senators possibly support and promote this? And or is there a representative that's assigned to the district in which we're hoping to do this project?
Right.
That will be willing to put forward your request to the respective appropriations account.
So it actually is touching on something that we spend a lot of time talking about, which is grant writing is not all about writing.
No.
There's some relationship building, and whether it's you as the grant writer, if you have a larger organization, maybe it's not you, the grant development person that's going after that, but letting your executive director know, or your mayor, or your whoever it might be, to really that's how it works. It is building, first understanding, is it even a possibility, and then maybe building that relationship. It's not fill out a form and get money, which is how a lot of people who aren't in our field think how grants work, you know?
Yeah, so it is very different from grants in many respects. I'm doing the 2-hour training at the GrantSummit, and I think we'll maybe spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about the actual application itself.
Right.
The rest of it is trying to get people to understand the landscape
Yeah.
that they're in, trying to understand how to navigate with their respective Congress people, trying to figure out how they can build community support to hopefully get enough momentum behind these projects so that ultimately, when the time comes for the representatives and the Senate to fight out and decide what's going to stay in these respective omnibus bills and what's going to go, that's something they call a conference committee.
Right.
Usually happens around August or September, so that in theory we have a new budget by October 1st, right? But that's clearly not been happening. I think
Yeah.
right now they've certainly held off because it's an election year, and it's really important to see who's going to win what and
Right.
where, to then decide how much power they can leverage in things. So there's a very important part of, I don't want to say playing politics because that's not what's happening here, but understanding how to navigate things.
Understanding how it works.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that you're not spending all your energy preparing something for
Yes.
an application that you're never going to get a
Right.
chance to submit.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, no matter how beautifully you have written that application, the appropriations language is usually not even a full sentence long.
Yeah.
It is a summary of what you're doing, and that's what gets put in the legislation.
Like more spots in after-school programs
Right.
for kids in underserved communities. They'll probably say children.
Sure, right. But it's a very brief thing.
Yeah.
Now, on the back end of things, it is important to have some objectives and to have some other things because there is accountability, as I mentioned, and you will have a program officer that's going to ask you for reports. Because the first time I got an appropriations, I was so excited. I thought, oh, they're just going to cut me a check. It's
gonna be great.
And it was it was like, I think, $180,000 to get an electronic sign for one of the nonprofits that I had because we had a prominent place and we did a lot of really great community work. And so it was like $180,000, right? And I thought, oh, great. So now they're just going to write me a check and we're good, right? And
Nope.
that's not exactly how it works. You basically then have to go through a reverse engineered grant application process where you have a program officer They're checking your objectives. They're making sure you spent the money like you said you were going to. It's still subject to all the audits in that regard.
It's federal money.
So it is still a
Yep.
grant,
Yep.
but it's just a whole different process by which you come to that grant, which is trying to make sure that those that need to be fighting for you in those committee rooms understand why they're fighting for your project, and they're not willing to just give up your project in lieu of another project that maybe they want to fight for. And so that's another reason why now, as opposed to before, they're asking their representatives to number in order the priority of their projects.
Okay.
Now, I will tell you, the Senate has nowhere near instilled the same kinds of restrictions. In fact, the Senate, this last appropriations cycle, they had 24,000 requests.
Wow.
Okay?
That's a lot.
Yes.
I'm just going to drop
Especially
that.
when, well, there's 100 of them, but how many didn't participate? Like 13? So
29.
Yeah.
Oh.
So,
Yeah.
So 71
Now,
people turned into with that many requests.
here's the other
That's a lot.
secret that I want to let you guys in on, right?
We love secrets.
Even though your Republican senator and or representatives may tell you that they're officially not participating, most of them still do, behind closed doors. Now, you're never going to want to say that to them, right?
Yes.
You're not going to want to go to them and be like, listen, wink, wink, nod, nod. I
Yeah.
know you're going to do this. But I always give the suggestion to anybody that's going through this process, once you have at least one congressperson that is willing to submit your request to an appropriations account, you want to make sure that every single congressperson that is representing your state and or district is aware that it's there. Because what I have found is that these congressional delegations from each of the states will get together and figure out, okay, which ones are we really going to go to bat for,
Yeah.
right? Which ones are we really going to prioritize?
I really want to start singing In the Room Where It Happened.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's better to know. It is better to
Yeah.
share. That's one of the great things about GPA or just grant folks in general is we share information like that instead of
Reporting
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Well, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I think it's important to understand too. You're right. It's not just submitting an application, but having a relationship with your congressmen and women and their staff.
Yep.
I think can go a long way to hopefully help higher prioritizing your project. So what are you? I know mayors get involved. I know other elected officials, but what can grant professionals do as far as helping with relationships?
So here's the tip. Your mayor and your church leader and whoever, those people, they don't count and they don't really care. Your senators and your representatives do not really care about those leaders coming forward.
Really?
Here's why. They want to get reelected. One person only carries one vote.
okay.
It doesn't matter how important that person is to your community. What they do want to know, though, is that your project has a lot of community support. Not only community support, but a lot of people that know that that senator or representative has put forward your request to the respective appropriations committee. So you're better
Politics.
off. You are better
Politics.
off having a signed list of 500 people that are petitioning your senator or representative to
Okay.
say,
Letter.
we're watching you. We're watching this process, and we hope that next year when you announce which ones that you were able to get through, you got this project. And that is one of the sort of major mistakes that I hear people all the time, like, oh, well, our governor's willing to support us. They don't care. The governor has one vote.
Yeah. No, I never thought about it that way, but
Yeah.
you're absolutely right.
Right.
Now, I have worked with organizations in different states where I think it was the representatives versus the senators, they actually had a process. It's like, we're meeting on this day and
Yeah.
fill out this form. But what I'm hearing you say is, sure, you need to do what they're asking you to
Yeah.
do to share information, but realize that that's not the whole story.
Right. And don't get me wrong, it would not be a bad thing to send the governor or the mayor or business leaders letters of support too. But I think too many people are counting on the influence versus the impact that could be had with votes.
Well, and it's hard. The last one I worked on is probably about 2 years ago. It was through a representative, and her office very specifically said, we want community letters, as
Yes.
many as you can bring.
Yes.
But that is hard to, in a week or two. They pushed out through social media.
It was a 2-week turnaround.
And
yeah.
all kinds of stuff trying to get people. We did templates of letters, so it's not like we're asking you to write a letter from scratch. We're
Yeah.
like, you can just, and we gave detailed, as simply as possible. Go to this site, upload this, do
Yes.
this thing. they didn't get a ton to do it, and so that is a hard thing. I
That's
think.
why you don't start in March.
Exactly.
I was going to say you don't have to start during that period.
That's
you start
what-
beforehand.
And that's part of what I coach. This is a year-long process, right?
Oh, yeah.
So my advice is usually around October, November, December, you want to be inviting your senator and or representatives that could possibly put forward a request. And you can tell, I have resources that I'm happy to share. I have a list of all the senators that will participate or have participated in the past and those that have
We'll
not.
provide that in the show notes.
Yes. I have a list of all the representatives in the past that have and have not, right? So you want to start preparing, okay, we think based on past experience, these senators will and these representatives will. And then you invite it's usually their staff, right? They are not usually going to come, but their
Always
staff,
staff. They're
listen, the
great.
staff is who you want to work with, right?
Absolutely.
So you invite them and their staff to come for a site visit or come to a presentation and make it brief, right? Make sure there's food. You can't give them swag, but they can certainly eat and drink, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Make sure that they're well fed and that give them a tour, explain to them what you're trying to do. So you want to just initially create awareness of the project. No ask. Don't mention appropriations. Just say, we're here. We just want to share with you what you're doing. If you know of any resources, if you know of any other organizations we should be working with, please let us know. But we just wanted you to be aware of what resources we provide to your community. That's the first step, right?
Yeah.
Then after the new year, because nobody's going to get anything done in December, right?
True.
After the new year, once you're in January, that's when you really want to start collecting those letters. And you're going to have a general sense of what it is you're probably going to want to request each year. Now, I will tell you that the accounts, which are sort of like the subcategories within each of those appropriations, those 12 appropriations bills, so they're called accounts. The accounts have been slowly dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. So you can't be certain until they announce that year's rules which account you might be able to apply in. So sometimes you do have to pivot, like, oh, that account's completely gone now, and it doesn't really make sense to try to squish it into another one, so let's think of another. But most of the time, you have a good sense of what your organization needs.
Yeah.
You have a good sense of what you're going to want to be looking for the money for. So starting in January and February, you start collecting those letters, those petitions, you start getting people ready for it, is because they want to see the masses are not only supporting the project, but that they're going to watch as it goes through, okay?
Yeah.
Because that's, if they feel that there's eyes on them, they're less likely to strike your project off that list when compromises have to be made.
Yeah.
Because that is ultimately what happens. You have a bill that is passed by the Senate, you have a bill that is passed by the representatives, and then they get together and they figure out, okay, we ultimately have to come up with one bill that is word for word identical in each of our houses or each of the house of the legislature, and then that's what we have to pass and then send it to the president. So you want to make sure that from March all the way through September and beyond, if it's one of those years where you don't have a budget, that they feel like there are regular eyes on them. So March, April is usually when they're submitting those requests to the respective appropriations and sub-appropriations accounts. And there's not much that can be done at that time. I will tell you, if your senator or representative has said, yes, we're going to submit this, it's pretty much a rubber stamp, okay? Rarely does it get to the appropriations or sub-appropriations account in March, April, May timeframe, where it doesn't just get put in if the senator or representative asks for it.
Gotcha.
Then you move to like June and July, which is when the entire Senate has to approve theirs and the entire House. There's a little bit of cutting that does happen during that time frame, but again, because they know so much is going to be given up later on when they're in the case conference, they're usually loath to cut too much, right? It's like, we can cut it when we need to. But it doesn't hurt to remind them at the beginning of June, hey, we just want to say, thank you so much for submitting our requests to this appropriation account. We're really excited. We know it's going for a full Senate vote and a full full representatives vote. We just want to thank you for your ongoing support of our projects. And then you send a couple other letters, right, from your community, or you send a petition or something, right?
Yeah.
Does it need to be something new, or can you send, remember we did this thing, or are you saying, hey, you actually go out and do it again? I'm just curious.
You could do both. If you had a ton already in the first place, it doesn't hurt to just remind them. Remember, we had 10,000 people that signed, right? If you haven't had the chance to do that in January, February, especially if you were in a position where you had to pivot what it was you were doing, then maybe in the meantime you're continuing to amass and you're sending out new, okay?
Yeah.
And then the key time is usually at the end of July, beginning of August, once they're getting back from their recess and they're starting to get back into the nitty-gritty. This is where they're rolling up their sleeves, and this is where they have to really decide, what am I willing to fight for and what am I willing to let go in order to get those other things that I want to fight for in. And so that is when it's really crucial for their staff to be reminded that all eyes are on them. Right? Now, you don't want to harangue them. You don't want to harass them. You don't want them having 20,000 calls. So it's up to you to kind of organize how they're going to get that. And usually I would only do it with one, maybe two sort of touches, as we say in our speak, right?
Yeah.
So, but you want to make sure that especially at that crucial time, that's the pivotal time where you're most likely to fall off that list. So make sure that they know you've got that support and that support is eagerly awaiting the results.
Yes.
Nice. So I love that it's, I won't say love, but I'm glad that we're establishing that it is a year-round
Yeah.
process. And it's not down to one grant writer sitting in a cubicle writing a beautiful letter.
No, you really do need to amass
The information needs to
support.
be there. You need to know
Yeah.
the priorities and the outcomes and all of that. I feel like we kind of touched on
Yeah.
how to involve community stakeholders in there. In bringing those letters, like if you had 10,000 signatures, but some of them were from key community stakeholders, is that sort of worth pointing out gently?
Yeah, I think it is, because they do know that those people will have influence and they might
Yeah,
share
I mean-
information, right?
Yeah.
It's also really important, and we haven't really talked about this, so if you have other funders or if you have other collaborative partners that are in on part of this project, I think it's also really important to talk about that so that they understand that it's ultimately these appropriations, these discretionary appropriations or congressionally directed spending as we call them now, right? They want to understand that there's a great public benefit, okay? That's why only nonprofits, institutions of higher education, schools, tribal entities, local and state governments are eligible to apply for those things, right? For-profits are not allowed to apply, individuals are not allowed to apply. And most of the time in the questions that they do ask you, because what will happen when they announce their rules is each senator and representative that is going to participate will usually put out a form, whether it's a Word form or a Google form, right? And they say, answer these questions. Which account do you want to apply to? How much are you asking for? Da-da-da-da, right? And almost invariably, one of the questions will be, how does this benefit the public? Because not only do they want to make sure that it is going to be eligible, they want to be able to say to their constituents, look at what I did for our community,
Yeah,
right?
I'm helping you.
This is a big brag for every one of them. And we should be holding them accountable for what they are or are not doing for our communities.
I mean, it's true.
It is. Well, and that's an important thing to note too, because I don't know how many times I've had a client that's like, hey, I just heard my representative's doing these, is doing these. I looked at the application. It's not real hard. You should be able to knock that out in a week or two. And while as a grant professional, can I write what needs to be written?
Yes.
Yeah.
But you're not going to have all of that other, you haven't met with them beforehand. You don't have the community support. You don't have all those things. And
The
then they're
letters, the petitions.
and then they're
the
shocked
letters
when they
of
don't get
support.
funded because their project is so great.
Especially if your senator, and listen, I'm not knocking the senators, they're an
Yes.
important part of it, but if your senator, it was, as I mentioned, it was like something 17 to 24,000 requests, right? You're one of a number of
Thousands.
pebbles on the beach, right?
Yeah.
Thousands.
So your application will mean virtually nothing in that regard.
Yeah.
But it's good to know. It's always better to know. But also the importance of getting your whole organization involved.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and it's good to know that as a grant professional, why this is helpful to understand the process too is when your boss or your board or your client is coming to you going, we've got 2 weeks, we can make this happen, right? You can do this. No, actually, it's
Yeah.
good to know so you can say, actually, this is a year-long process.
Yep.
We should have started 12 months ago.
Or
Yeah.
bring it up now.
Yes.
Hey,
Like,
this
Which is why we do this every November, because this is the crucial time to start
Yeah.
thinking about how we're going to do these things. And there's yet another resource I'll be happy to share with you and your listeners.
We love
Yes.
resources.
Yes.
It's a year-long timeline. Here's what you should be doing in October and November. Here's what you should be doing in
I love a
January.
good
Here's what you should
timeline.
be doing, right?
Yes.
And it's a planning sheet.
Yeah.
In addition to who are my senators, who are my representative, who is or are my representatives that might
Right.
be interested. So quick note, because not everybody understands this, I take this for granted. So every state has 1 to 52 representatives.
Yep.
And it's broken up by districts.
Yes.
So if you are in Denver, Colorado, right, I'm sure there's gonna be 1 or maybe 2 representatives that will represent your district.
Yeah.
Those are the primary representatives that you really want to worry about initially getting their interest and understanding about your project and the community support behind it,
Yeah.
right? Then once you get that, and hopefully your senator or senators are also willing to support it, once you know that 1 or more of them are submitting it to the appropriations bill, then you let all the rest of them know. As I mentioned, right? It's important for them to understand. Now, there is a small bit of competition, obviously, that's going to happen. But remember, your representatives are limited to 15 requests that they can make each.
That's right.
And so that's why it's really important that your entire congressional delegation understands that this request is being submitted, it's out there. We would really like your support. Here's how we're going to impact not just our area, but perhaps the whole state or other adjoining districts, right? And so then you start bringing in other congressional delegates that could also help support things.
I love it. I love it. It's a lot of work too.
It is a
Clearly.
lot of
It's-
work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's I just want to keep saying it's the year round. It's the year round.
Yeah.
It's not you, grant writer person, fill out this form.
Sit in your cube and
That's not
tackle it.
how it works.
Yes, but here's now. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer. There's a lot of things that I've talked about, like, oh, it doesn't work that way, or we think it's that way and it's not. But here's one of the reasons why you should consider doing an appropriations if you think that you have Congress people that are willing to
Yeah.
support it, right? The average award of most appropriations or congressionally directed spending is anywhere between 1.5 and 1.8 million, give or take a couple $100,000. And that is the low end, right? That's
Yeah.
like the low end of, you've got some of them that blow them out of the water. You get like $32 million. That's going to
Yeah.
mess it up, right? Most of the time, the sweet spot for appropriations is between about $500,000 and about $3 million
Per
per request.
okay.
Okay, that's
Just to
usually,
clarify.
That's
Yeah.
the ballpark in which you're going to want to think about your project and your
the
ask.
size.
I
yeah.
get people that are like, we want to ask for 10,000. I'm like, it is not worth it
No.
to do all that work for $10,000.
Federal grants at all are not worth it for $10,000.
Am
let's
I?
be clear.
Yeah.
I'm always surprised when I look at the appropriations list, and I think the lowest last year was a $7,000 request. I have to
No.
hope they did very little work and that their senator or representative just loved them and that they didn't end up having to do a lot of work for it. But most of the time, these are big dollar grants that even other organizations that may not have a lot of grant dollars that are coming in or a lot of funding that is coming in, to say I could get between $500,000 and $3 million for this process, that is a huge, huge influx of dollars
Yeah.
for these communities. And so in that regard, it really is important to think about whether or not this process is right for you, to think about whether or not you feel like you can get the congressional support to go forward with it.
Right.
And if you're like, if I put all this work in, is the community going to say, yes, this is important enough for me to write a letter, to sign a petition, to follow up with my senator and representative? You want to make sure that you are thinking about the potential payoff for these, which is why they are so important.
Yeah.
Last year, we did just under $15 billion of discretionary appropriations for our communities with about 8,000 projects. So 8,000 individual projects around the U.S. were funded with $15 billion.
That's some big ticket awards.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the other take home is
Yeah.
if you are a really small organization and you don't, 500,000, I hate to say that because who couldn't use $500,000, but to think about the relative relationship between the money that you think you could reasonably use to serve your community, the work you're going to have to do to get this, and then sort of the management of it
Yeah.
afterwards, because
Yeah.
there will be, salesmen
to-
will call, there will be grant management.
Yeah, and I've worked at nonprofits where it's like a 1 to 3 person staff.
Yeah, this is
right?
what I'm talking about.
I've been there. I understand your pain, and so that is an internal conversation that you and or your board, you're going to need to have that conversation.
That's a heavy lift.
To say this is a heavy lift with a potential amazing payout.
Yeah.
Is it right for us? And
Yeah.
it may not always be right, and there's nothing wrong with that either.
No.
That's true.
This is some good stuff.
I love learning
I
stuff.
know.
So I'm pretty sure that people are really going to want to beat down your virtual door to get access to this and some other things you do. What is the best way for people to connect with you and this really important work that you're doing?
Okay, so there's a couple ways.
Sure.
I am on LinkedIn, so you can search by my name, Tonia Brown-Kinzel. And I'm happy to accept all requests. I think LinkedIn is wonderful, unless you're trying to get me to do some kind of franchise, right? Like
Yeah,
get those
that is
fun
fair.
requests, right?
Fair.
But LinkedIn's an amazing way to connect with each other. I also work for the Grant Plant, so you could always send me an email at the Grant Plant. It's Tonia, Tonia, at the Grant Plant, and then the letters NM for NewMexico.com. Or you can send it to my personal email if you want, thegrantcrafter@gmail.com. Those 3
Giving
ways.
out the personal email.
Man, you're a brave woman.
Wow.
Whatever you feel comfortable with. So
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us
Thank
today.
you.
This is great stuff.
thanks.
We really appreciate
I
it.
appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
It was a pleasure.
Yay.
Absolutely.
Great.